The Shroud of Turin is believed to be the actual burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. It's a very unique artifact because we get in this singular artifact the death, burial, and resurrection of the historical Jesus.
The Shroud of Turin has been dismissed for centuries as a medieval fake, just a blurry stain on old linen and a story people wanted to believe. But a new AI analysis treated the cloth like forensic evidence, scanning for structure instead of symbolism, and found something unsettling. The image behaves less like paint and more like stored information. We are going to unpack the mind-bending AI finding that turns the shroud from a relic into a signal, and why that makes some scientists nervous to explain it clearly. The cloth that acts alive. The Shroud of Turin is often described as a simple relic, a long strip of old linen with a faint image on it. At first glance, it almost looks unimpressive. The figure is pale, incomplete, and easy to dismiss as a stain or shadow. But that faintness is exactly where the problem begins, because the image does not behave like something that was painted, pressed, or rubbed onto cloth. It behaves like something that happened to the cloth, and that difference is what has kept this object alive in scientific debate for over a century. When researchers first examined the shroud closely, they noticed that the image does not soak into the fabric. Paint bleeds, dye spreads, ink follows the threads. But on the shroud, the image sits only on the outermost surface of the linen fibers. If you cut a single thread and look at it under magnification, the inside of the fiber is clean and white. Only the very top layer carries color. This means the cloth was not colored in the usual way. It was altered at the surface, almost as if the fibers themselves were changed chemically for a brief moment. This is where modern analysis, especially AI-based pattern detection, changes the conversation. The AI did not look at the shroud as a religious symbol or a historical artifact. It looked at it as data. When it scanned the image, it found that the marks were not random. Beneath the faint human form, the system detected repeating symmetry and structure hidden inside what looks like visual noise. In other words, the image follows rules. It has order. That alone is strange, because random stains do not obey consistent patterns across an entire human figure. Even more unsettling is how the image relates to distance. The darkness of each part of the image appears to correspond to how close that part of the body was to the cloth. Areas that would have been closer to the fabric appear darker. Areas farther away appear lighter. This relationship is smooth and continuous, not guessed or stylized. A human artist would normally add shading to make something look three-dimensional, but the shroud does not use artistic shading. It uses what looks like measurement. The image intensity behaves like a physical response, not a creative choice. The background of the cloth deepens the mystery. Outside the body image, there is no attempt to fill space, frame the figure, or hide edges. The surrounding linen is quiet. It shows no signs of the process that formed the image affecting it at all. This suggests whatever created the image acted only where a body was present and ignored everything else. That kind of selectivity is hard to explain with common methods like heat, smoke, or chemicals, which usually spread and blur. Taken together, these features make the shroud feel less like an object that was worked on, and more like an object that recorded something. The cloth does not just display an image. It responds as if it was exposed to a brief, controlled event that left information behind. That is why some researchers say the shroud does not feel dead or finished. It behaves like evidence waiting to be read. And once you see it that way, the next question becomes unavoidable. What kind of event could leave a mark like that without destroying the cloth? The AI did not just find a pattern. It pointed straight at a detail so tiny that it makes the paint idea feel almost impossible. The nanometer problem. The most unsettling detail about the Shroud of Turin is not the image itself, but how impossibly thin that the image is. When scientists began measuring the depth of the discoloration on the linen fibers, they expected to find pigment or damage penetrating into the threads. That is what happens with paint, dye, smoke, or heat. Instead, they found something that broke every expectation. The image exists only on the outermost surface of the fibers, with a depth measured in mere hundreds of nanometers. To understand how extreme this is, consider that a single human hair is roughly 80,000 nanometers thick. The shroud's image is thinner than a soap bubble and barely scratches the surface of the cloth. This creates a serious technical problem. Any method that involves liquid, pressure, or prolonged heat would soak into the fibers or spread sideways. Even a skilled medieval artist would not be able to control material at this scale. There were no tools capable of selectively altering only the outer skin of a linen fiber, while leaving the interior completely untouched. Yet, that is exactly what the shroud shows. The color does not bleed. It does not crack. It does not pool. It simply appears on the surface, uniform and consistent across the entire image. When artificial intelligence examined this structure, it did not see evidence of craftsmanship. It saw a pattern consistent with rapid surface-level chemical change. The AI treated each fiber as a data point and compared how the image behaved across the cloth. What emerged was a clear conclusion. The process that formed the image acted almost instantly. It did not linger long enough to burn, soak, or spread. This implies a burst, not a slow application. A moment, not a method. The sharpness of the image reinforces this problem. At a microscopic level, the boundaries between image and non-image fibers are clean. There is no gradual fade caused by spreading heat or drifting smoke. The transition is abrupt. This suggests the energy that created the image traveled in straight, parallel paths rather than radiating outward. In everyday life, light and heat scatter. They lose focus as they move. But the shroud's image shows no such blur. It behaves more like a controlled beam than a natural glow. This is where the laws of physics start to feel uncomfortable. A process that can change linen at a depth of only a few hundred nanometers over the full surface of a human-sized image without damaging the cloth would require an extremely precise balance of energy. Too weak, and nothing happens. Too strong, and the linen burns or vaporizes. The margin for error is almost non-existent. Yet the result is stable and uniform, as if the event that caused it was perfectly tuned. The nanometer problem removes many comforting explanations. It rules out paint, dye, acids, and simple heat. It even challenges ideas like contact scorching or rubbing, which cannot maintain that level of microscopic control. What remains is not a familiar tool or technique, but an unknown process that acted briefly, selectively, and with extraordinary precision. And once that realization settles in, the mystery stops being about belief or tradition.
For centuries, the Shroud of Turin has become one of the most mysterious and controversial pieces of cloth on the face of the planet. It's a hoax, or it's an ordinary person.
It becomes about how such a process could exist at all, and why no known human method, ancient or modern, can fully account for what the cloth records. The shroud did something in 1898 that no medieval image should be able to do, and it set the trap that AI just tightened. The negative that shouldn't exist. In 1898, an Italian photographer named Secondo Pia aimed his camera at the Shroud of Turin. The surprise came after development, when he inspected the glass plate negative. On the cloth, the figure looks pale and uncertain, like a stain that refuses to settle into a face. On the negative, the tones flip, and the image snaps into something far more readable. Facial features strengthen, the body outline becomes clearer, and the whole figure resembles an ordinary photograph. The shroud appears inverted in a way that lines up with photographic logic. If the cloth already behaves like a negative, It suggests the information is encoded in reverse, long before anyone understood photography well enough to plan for that effect. That matters because it is a strange target for a forger. Most fakes are built for immediate viewing. An artist darkens the eyebrows, adds shading under the nose, and smooths the transitions until the viewer's eye accepts the illusion. A negative style image demands the opposite logic. The maker would have to choose tonal values that look wrong on the cloth so that a later reversal makes them look right. Doing that across an entire body, while keeping proportions believable and avoiding obvious brush marks, would be a deeply unusual artistic strategy. The claim isn't therefore impossible, but rather therefore less straightforward than a normal painted fake. Image tools that were mechanical and blunt rather than smart. In the 1970s, researchers used a VP8 image analyzer, a device that converts brightness into height. With normal photographs, this typically produces warped terrain, because brightness in real photos depends on lighting and contrast, not on physical depth. A shadow on a flat surface can be dark, and a bright highlight can sit on a deep curve. The mapping is inconsistent. Yet when shroud photographs were processed this way, the output was said to form a stable, 3D-like relief rather than a lumpy distortion. The key idea is that the image brightness behaves more like distance information than like artistic shading. Newer tools did not invent the puzzle. They refine what can be seen. Digital processing can reduce cloth weave patterns, burn damage, and uneven discoloration, making the underlying image easier to inspect. Some AI-style denoising aims to separate repeating textile texture from irregular features, leaving a cleaner map of the figure. Supporters say that the cleaner the signal becomes, the less it resembles hand-drawn art, and the more it resembles a kind of imprint. Critics respond that aggressive filtering can also amplify patterns or encourage overreading, so method and transparency matter. Then comes the detail that turns curiosity into a timeline fight, reports of faint, coin-like impressions over the eyes.
Notice that there appear to be coins in the eye sockets of the man on the shroud.
What was the point of having a coin on the eye?
Keep the eyes closed.
But the key is, whose coin is it?
These are described as barely there shapes, not bold outlines. Yet some claim they match first-century coin designs. If that identification held up under strict testing, it would shift the debate from how was the image made to when could it have been made, because coins are datable artifacts that anchor a scene in time. Put together, the negative effect, the VP8 depth behavior, the modern cleanup results, and the alleged eye details create one narrative. The shroud keeps acting less like a simple picture and more like an object carrying extractable information. Each new method reduces ambiguity, yet also raises sharper questions about origin. The next clue is so subtle that humans argued about it for years, until modern enhancement made it harder to ignore. Coins, blood, and the order of events. One of the most controversial details is the claim that faint impressions near the eyes resemble small Roman coins. Critics dismiss it as pareidolia, people seeing patterns because they want to. Supporters treat it like a buried timestamp, a tiny historical clue sitting quietly in the noise. The point isn't that everyone agrees coins are there. It's that, if the coin hypothesis were correct, it would be unusually specific. A medieval craftsman trying to manufacture a relic would normally make the proof obvious. Bold symbols, readable text, dramatic details meant to convince on sight. Here, the alleged feature is described as so faint that it only becomes arguable after enhancement and careful analysis. That raises a fair question. Why would someone hide their strongest historical anchor so deeply that it takes modern image processing to even notice it? A hoaxer can certainly be clever, but hoaxes usually aim for impact, not for invisibility. This is also where modern digital tools change the conversation. Enhancements can reduce cloth texture, emphasize subtle circular contrasts, and make tiny distortions appear more coherent. Supporters argue that the shapes align with coin-sized forms consistent with the early Roman period, which, if true, would be an odd thing to guess centuries in advance. Skeptics counter that enhancement can create false structure, especially when the original signal is weak and the human brain wants a match. Either way, the coin debate functions as a hinge. It pushes the story away from mysterious image toward date dispute. If those markings really correspond to a known coin type, the shroud stops being only about how the image formed and becomes about when the scene it depicts could plausibly belong. The blood argument is different. It is less about recognizing shapes and more about sequence. A recurring claim is that the stains are real blood and that they were deposited before the body image appeared, because the image does not show through areas where the blood sits. That ordering matters because it implies layering. First blood transfer, then image formation, with the latter process not overriding the earlier stains. In practical terms, that's difficult to reproduce with conventional painting. If a person painted a body onto cloth after adding blood, you would expect overlap, smearing, pigment mixing, or, at a minimum, evidence that one material disturbed the other. The claim suggests something more like a timeline recorded on fabric, multiple stages rather than a single artistic act. Then there's the additional observation that many stains look oddly undisturbed. In an ordinary scenario, wrapping a body, shifting it, removing the cloth, you would expect dragging, streaking, or blotches pulled in a direction of movement. Some argue the marks appear pristine, as if the cloth separated without the friction and smearing you'd predict. That doesn't automatically prove a miracle. It could also reflect careful handling, limited movement, or interpretive bias in how stains are read. But narratively, it reinforces the same pattern. The cloth seems to preserve contact effects without the mess of normal removal. When you combine these three ideas, possible early period details near the eyes, blood that appears to precede the image, and stains that don't look heavily disturbed, you get a coherent storyline. The cloth behaves less like a canvas and more like a recorder. That makes the shroud hard to file away as just a painted picture, because the strongest claims are not about artistry, but about timing and physical interaction. This is why the famous 1988 radiocarbon dating results became such a pressure point. A single date range offers a clean conclusion, an ending you can print in a headline. But if the tested sample wasn't representative, or if later factors affected that corner of the cloth, then the neat ending becomes unstable. And once the ending is unstable, all the unresolved questions, coins, blood, sequence, and image behavior rush back to the center. The biggest case-closed moment in shroud history may rest on one corner of fabric that was not what it seemed. The corner sample controversy. In 1988, 3 laboratories reported a medieval date range for the shroud sample, and the public takeaway was simple: case closed. A neat number replaced a messy mystery, but the uncomfortable detail has always been where the material came from. The piece was cut from a corner, an edge that had been handled repeatedly, exposed to the environment, and potentially altered by repair after past damage. In archaeology and forensic work, sampling location can decide the outcome. If a cloth has endured centuries of touching, smoke, heat, water, display, and storage conditions, then a corner is often the worst candidate for pure original material. A contaminated or altered sample can produce an accurate date for the contamination or the alteration, while still missing the true origin story of the main cloth. This isn't special pleading, it's basic evidence logic. If you scrape soot from a surface and date the soot, you haven't dated the surface. If you test a patched section of an old garment, you might date the patch. The shroud debate revolves around whether that corner was representative of the full linen, or whether it was, in effect, a problem zone. Exactly the kind of place that yields a clean-looking result that answers the wrong question. What was reportedly found when leftover threads and fibers from that region were examined later? Chemist Raymond Rogers is often associated with this argument. The claim is that the sample area contained features not seen in the main body of the cloth, coatings or surface treatments, and traces of cotton interwoven or mixed in. The key narrative idea here isn't one researcher settles it. The key idea is that there is a serious, technically grounded argument that the dated piece may not have matched the rest of the linen. If the laboratories date a repaired or reworked region, then the result does not automatically translate to the whole cloth is medieval.
Dr. Ray Rogers, a fellow at Los Alamos National Laboratory, he measured the vanillin content, which is when the flax decomposes, it produces this, and he said that it has to be between 1,300 and 3,000 years old. Again, that would be Christ, not medieval times.
It would mean, at minimum, that a portion of the corner is newer, which is a very different claim. The dating would still be true, but it would be true about the corner's history, not necessarily about the shroud's full history. Other approaches have been used that aim to estimate age through material behavior rather than carbon counts alone, and some of these have been presented as pointing older, closer to a roughly 2,000-year time frame. Whether one accepts those methods fully or treats them as suggestive but not decisive, they change the shape of the debate. The dating question stops being a settled number and becomes a conflict of methods, samples, and assumptions. Carbon dating gives one answer based on one cut. Other tests claim to read aging through different physical or chemical signatures. When results diverge, the real issue becomes which samples are truly representative, and what processes could shift one measurement without shifting another. That tension is exactly where pattern-based comparison becomes attractive, because it can weigh multiple data sets against each other instead of treating one test as the final verdict. Instead of asking, which headline wins, it asks, do independent lines of evidence converge, or do they keep splitting apart? This leads into one of the more striking cross-checks often raised alongside the shroud, the Sudarium of Oviedo, a separate cloth claimed to have a documented history earlier than the medieval period. Some comparisons argue that the blood patterns on the two cloths align in ways that make geometric sense, as if both were associated with the same injured head under different wrapping conditions. If that correspondence is even partly real, it creates a two-object problem. You can't dismiss one without accounting for the relationship to the other, because the question becomes bigger than a single artifact. So the storyline shifts. It's no longer just, is this image a fake? It becomes, why do multiple lines of evidence keep refusing to line up with a simple, single-step explanation? That's where the unease creeps in. Not fear of a relic, but fear of a conclusion that won't stay neatly boxed. If two cloths tell the same story, then the debate is no longer just about age. It becomes about what kind of event could imprint data onto linen at all. The AI treats it like evidence. A striking claim in the discussion is that AI can sidestep the culture war and focus on physical behavior. AI can approach the shroud like a scene, not a symbol. It doesn't respect tradition, and it doesn't fear backlash. It runs pattern tests. It asks blunt questions. Does this behave like pigment sitting on top of fibers? Like dye soaking through threads? Like scorch marks from heat? Like contact transfer from a body? Or like some chemistry that selectively changes the outer surface?
There are 3D information encoded in the Shroud of Turin. No other picture does that. I want to make sure this sets in. There's 3D information.
What does
There's
that
like
mean?
a holographic topography brightness map of the man of the shroud.
When framed that way, the shroud stops being an icon and becomes a data object, an unusual surface carrying a strange signal. The conclusion presented in this framing is that the image acts less like paint and more like a selective exposure. Something fast, intense, and brief, leaving behind an imprint-like pattern without the normal hallmarks of brushwork or liquid staining. The body-to-cloth relationship looks orthographic, meaning the mapping appears straight up and down rather than spreading outward. In plain words, the marking seems to form as if the cloth received information perpendicular to its surface, more like a controlled projection than a lamp shining from one side. A lamp creates shadows. Shadows create distortion. But when researchers process the shroud image with tools that translate brightness into depth, the result is often described as unusually stable. The reason this matters is simple. For 3D-like behavior to appear, intensity has to correlate with distance in a consistent way. If the image were driven mainly by artistic shading, the brightness pattern would reflect style and lighting choices, not geometry. If the brightness instead scales with how close the cloth was to the body, then the image is behaving like a measurement, like a crude topographic map rather than like an illustration. The no-Dikhi marks argument creates a timeline problem. A normal body left in cloth long enough will eventually produce telltale changes. Fluids, discoloration, decomposition byproducts, diffusion patterns. Yet the claim here is that the shroud shows blood transfer and bodily positioning cues without obvious signs of prolonged breakdown staining. If that observation holds, it suggests a narrow window. The body was present long enough for certain contact effects to occur, but not long enough for the usual long-term chemistry to overwhelm the cloth. And then, crucially, something changed abruptly. The body was no longer there, and the cloth did not show the kind of dragging smears you'd expect from ordinary removal. Even without declaring certainty, that combination, contact evidence plus an apparent lack of extended decay signatures, tightens the timeline and raises the pressure on any proposed mechanism. This is where the phrase "terrified to explain" starts to make psychological sense. Once you accept even part of the physical oddness, surface-level coloration, distance-coded intensity, negative-like tonal behavior, and a selectively quiet background, you step into a zone where ordinary explanations sound thin. Thin explanations don't just sound wrong, they can damage reputations. If you say "unknown process," you invite ridicule for dodging the hard part. If you say "rare natural event," you inherit the burden of demonstrating a mechanism that fits every constraint. If you say "human trick," you must account for the apparent superficiality of the image, the absence of obvious pigment behavior, and the way depth-like information seems to persist under analysis. Every route has a trap waiting. So researchers do what humans often do when the center is too hot. They shift the argument to safer ground. Dates, labels, institutional politics, debates that feel measurable and familiar. But the question that keeps pushing back through all that noise is the one nobody can comfortably hold in their bare hands. What kind of energy, or what kind of event, could produce an image that behaves like this? The next theories don't begin with belief, they begin with one brutal requirement: an energy burst that can change linen at the surface without destroying it. The light burst theory. A leading laboratory-style attempt to replicate the effect. Short wavelength ultraviolet radiation that colors linen only on the top layer. A specific band of light can mimic the surface level change. This is important because it gives the mystery a foothold in testable physics. Not a hand wave, not a vibe. A lab path that at least imitates the shallow depth. The power requirement is the real shock. To scale this up to a full human-sized image, the needed burst would be enormous. So enormous it is compared to extreme events, yet happening in a time window so short that the cloth is not ruined. This creates a strange equation: high power, ultra-short duration, controlled delivery. In plain terms, it's like needing a lightning-bright flash that somehow does not burn the house down. If the burst is real, it implies an event, not a craft. Craft is slow. Craft requires touch. Craft leaves habits and mistakes. An ultra-fast burst implies something happened in a moment. And that moment idea is what makes people uneasy, because it invites interpretations that go beyond normal lab talk. Proposals like mass-to-energy conversion concepts, or a highly charged discharge like a plasma effect. And there is another reason scientists step carefully. If you say, "a burst did it," you must explain why it is so geometrically consistent. Why does it map distance so cleanly? Why does it not blur outward? Why does it look like a controlled projection? Nature can be violent and bright, but nature is often messy. The Shroud claims, as presented, point to something unusually ordered. So the conversation drifts toward the strangest idea in the, what if the image looks like a form passing through a plane? It's the kind of sentence that makes a lab room go quiet. Not because it is proven, but it is the kind of model you reach for when ordinary models fail to fit. And if that sounds unreal, the final question is worse. What if the image's geometry hints at a kind of shadow effect that our usual models were never built to describe? The shadow of a shift hypothesis. The introduces the most mind-bending possibility. The image behaves like a three-dimensional object interacting with a two-dimensional surface in a way that resembles a cross-section or projection. The shroud acts less like a picture and more like an imprint of a transformation. Not a normal contact print, but a data-rich mark that preserves shape, depth, and proportional relationships. In this framing, the cloth is not decorated, it is informed. The repeated symmetries and ratios imply scaffolding. The AI detected subtle proportional relationships across features: eyes, hands, ribs, like a hidden geometric framework. The battle is no longer religion versus science, it's explanation versus embarrassment. Because the shroud has become a trap for confident statements. If someone says it's fake, they must explain the surface depth anomaly, the negative behavior, the 3D mapping, and the selective background. If someone says it's authentic, they must explain the energy and mechanism. If someone says we don't know, they must admit that a famous object may contain a kind of information that our tools are only now learning to read. And that admission threatens the neat stories people like. Neat stories sell. Unsolved data puzzles do not. Fear of being pushed into a simple yes or no answer when the data is complicated. Either this is the most advanced trick ever made, or it is a record of an event we do not know how to reproduce. Both options are unsettling. One implies a genius beyond its time. The other implies physics we do not fully understand. And that leaves you with the same final question that dares to ask in its own way. If AI is right, that the image behaves like data, then maybe the shroud is not a debate that ends. Maybe it is a signal that only gets louder as our tools improve. If you made it this far, I want your honest take. Is this a brilliant, human-made trick that got ahead of history? Or is it evidence of a process we still can't explain in plain words? Comment on your theory, because I read them, and they shape what we cover next. Like the video, subscribe, and click the next video on screen if you want more deep dives into strange evidence, hidden patterns, and mysteries that refuse to stay quiet.